Hi everyone, welcome to another episode of the WOW History Channel. My name is Ron Guth, and each week I present a historical topic that hopefully will make you say, wow, I've never heard that before. This week's topic is the yellow fever epidemic that ravaged through Philadelphia, Pennsylvania in 1793. I've known about the problems that Philadelphia faced late in the 1790s with yellow fever because of my association with numismatics or coin collecting. The first U.S. mint opened in Philadelphia in 1793, and they dealt with the yellow fever epidemics in that year and some years thereafter. There are quite a few similarities between the yellow fever epidemic of 1793 and our current COVID pandemic, and we'll take a look at some of those. For a great read on the subject, I recommend J.M. Powell's book called Bring Out Your Dead: The Great Plague of Yellow Fever in Philadelphia in 1793. But first, what is yellow fever? Like COVID, yellow fever is a virus. It's caused by a virus. Yellow fever is not as contagious as COVID. Rather, it's transmitted from person to person by mosquito bites. This fact was first confirmed by Walter Reed. I'll bet that's a familiar name to you. In 1901, when he confirmed a theory of a Cuban doctor who theorized that mosquitoes were the vectors that transmitted the disease. So what happens when you get yellow fever? In the early stages, it looks a lot like many other diseases such as the flu, so it's easy to misdiagnose. You'll see nausea, headache, chills, vomiting, muscle and back pain, fatigue, and loss of appetite. Most yellow fever cases last only a few days, and then it's over. However, in approximately 15% of cases, they'll develop jaundice, which is a yellowing of the skin, and that's caused by a failure of the liver. And then you'll also have hemorrhaging from the stomach, eyes, nose, and mouth, in extreme cases similar to what you see in Ebola. If you get to the jaundice point, you have a 20 to 50% chance of dying. When you hit the bleeding point, your chance of dying becomes 50% or greater. So you can see that yellow fever is a lot like COVID in that some cases are mild and others are fatal. You can get a vaccine, as I mentioned earlier, against yellow fever, but if you get the disease before you get the vaccine, you basically have to wait it out. There's not much that can be done except to provide comfort. According to Wikipedia, 127 severe cases were reported in 2013, resulting in 45,000 deaths. What is not reported is the number of mild or intermediate cases, which should be substantially higher. So, like COVID, it's a bad disease, but for many, it's a survivable disease. What about Philadelphia in 1793? Here's a wow fact. Philadelphia was the capital of the United States of America from 1790 to 1800. The reason being, Washington, D.C. had not yet been built. It was under construction at the time, and until 1800, the capital remained in Philadelphia. In 1793, Philadelphia had approximately 55,000 inhabitants. By the end of that year, nearly 5,000 people, or 10% of the population, had died, mostly from yellow fever. So if we apply that same ratio to America's population of approximately 328 million, and assuming that we had the same level of knowledge and treatments available, we would expect a death rate of over 30 million people if it happened today. So we have a big debt of gratitude owed to Walter Reed for figuring out how the disease was transmitted. Now, in 1793, Philadelphia had a tough year, kind of like what we're experiencing here in 2020. Spring came early in Philadelphia in 1793, and that brought with it a lot of rain. So there was marshy conditions, swampy conditions, because it's a rather low-lying city near the water. But then that was followed by intense heat and drought in the summertime. And this was just a perfect circumstances for mosquitoes to breed. To make it even worse, beginning in July, there were a bunch of ships that started arriving from the Caribbean, and these ships contained refugees from the islands that were experiencing a lot of warfare. And these were islands like Jamaica, Hispaniola, Grenada, Dominica, and others. And the refugees brought with them yellow fever that was then transmitted from them by the mosquitoes to the Philadelphians. By August, the first deaths began appearing, after which the fatality rate skyrocketed over the next 12 weeks. Yellow fever was not new to the Philadelphia doctors, but they hadn't seen it for over 30 years. The last epidemic was in 1762, and they knew neither the cause or how to treat it. Many believe that the pestilence was caused by dirty air, putrid water, and they even believe that it was caused by a large pile of rotting coffee that was down by the waterfront. They called the yellow fever the Barbados fever, because of the Caribbean. They called it the Palatine fever because a lot of Germans from the Palatine area had it, or the black vomit because that's one of the effects of the late stages of the disease. Now, some have claimed that if the signs of the yellow fever disease had been noted earlier, that it might have been contained, but that's sort of the same 2020 hindsight that we're using today with COVID. Today, the more we learn, the more we know, and the more we can adapt to treat it or prevent it. By late August, much of the population had simply left the city, escaping to the surrounding areas where they hoped to avoid and wait out the disease. Unfortunately, they didn't know that the mosquitoes were also there and that they were carrying the disease. That left the city filled with the poor and infirm, the blacks, and the doctors to deal with the plague. One of the great heroes of the yellow fever epidemic of 1793 was Dr. Benjamin Rush. Now, Rush was a signer of the Declaration of Independence, and for us numismatists, he was also the treasurer of the Mint from 1797 to 1813, where he later encountered even more yellow fever plagues. As famous as Rush was for treating the disease, he may have exacerbated some cases and even caused their untimely demise because of his aggressive treatments. Initially, he used bloodletting, which is literally bleeding patients out, and purging, which was just evacuation of the whole system. But after reading some old books about treatments that were used in 1762 in Philadelphia, he thought to himself, I'm not doing enough. So he actually ramped up the treatments that he had, often weakening the patients to the point where they had no hope of recovery. He also used a treatment called 10 and 10. That meant 10 grains of mercury and 10 grains of a thing called jalap, which is a drug that was used as a purge or a purgative. Now, once considered a miracle cure, mercury now is considered poisonous. So you can see that using 10 and 10 was actually a very dangerous treatment. Rush actually increased the dosages and the frequency with which it was administered over time as he saw some cases that improved because of the 10 and 10 treatment. Now, October saw the height of the plague, but once the weather became cooler and the mosquito population began to diminish, the number of daily deaths dropped as one might expect. However, it wasn't until November that the plague was finally over. This example of the Yellow Plague of 1793 tells us that there is literally nothing new under the sun. Plagues and epidemics have occurred frequently in the past, but we really only hear about the big ones. The bubonic plague, the black plague, the yellow fever plague of 1793 that we're talking about here today, the Spanish flu of 1918, and today we have COVID. But what's important to realize is that many plagues and many infections occur all the time. Yellow fever plagues occurred for a number of years in America, but we don't hear about them. They occurred in 1699, 1747, 1762, and 1793. A year later in 1794, then 1797, 1798, 1802, 1803, 1805, 1819, 1820, and 1853. And it's occurred in other American cities as well, like New Orleans in 1805. But yellow plague is also a modern disease. Between 1960 and 1962, yellow fever took as many as 30,000 lives in Ethiopia. If it were to happen again in the United States, there would be many deaths that would occur before the vaccine supply could be ramped up. So the time lag between the introduction of the disease and the ability to vaccinate against it would be enough time to cause significant numbers of death. The yellow fever plague of 1793 tells us that the world is not guaranteed to be a safe place. But should we live in fear of yellow fever? Well, really not more than we should be afraid of any other disease like flu and even COVID. So I hope you've learned something new from this video. If you like historic videos such as these, please be sure to hit the subscribe and like buttons below. That really helps me with the YouTube algorithm. If you hit the bell icon below, you'll receive a notification every time I post a new video, which is usually on Sunday. If you have ideas or suggestions for future topics, please let me know in the comments below. Thank you very much for viewing, and I'll see you again next week. Goodbye.